Well, the prosecution alleges that Duane Keffe D. Davis implicated himself in Shakur's murder after he published a book back in 2019. Here's what the prosecution had to say during their opening statements.
Davis did not pull the trigger. But what he did do was plan the retaliation for the beating of his nephew. Duane Davis made sure that the shooters were armed and ready to execute their revenge.
A man sits across from a Las Vegas homicide detective. He isn't a suspect, not yet. He isn't nervous, but he is just smiling. For nearly 3 decades, investigators found no gun nor cartridge casings and no physical evidence tying anyone to the car. The only man still alive who witnessed the shooting was the driver himself, and he spent 30 years refusing to talk. The murder of the world's most famous rapper had gone cold, filed away as one of hip-hop's greatest unsolved mysteries. Investigators had names and theories, but they were missing the one thing that mattered: proof. Then, this man decided to write a book. It wasn't a confession, but a memoir about street loyalty, gang politics, and a night on the Las Vegas Strip that changed music history. He gave interviews, sat for a documentary, and appeared on podcasts. Somewhere between the pages and the microphones, he described being inside the car when the shots were fired. The same car prosecutors say carried the gun that killed Tupac Shakur. He thought he was untouchable. He'd said it himself. He'd gotten away with it, but he was wrong. This is the Unsolved Vault, and today we're following the 30-year hunt for Tupac Shakur's killer and the man who may have revealed the truth himself, one interview at a time. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and stay with us, because the closer we get to the truth, the stranger this story becomes. It was supposed to be a good night. Weeks earlier, in the summer of 1996, a group of young men connected to a Compton street gang had attempted to rob a Death Row Records associate at a California shopping mall. That failed robbery would set a chain of events in motion that no one in Las Vegas could have predicted. Tupac Shakur had just watched Mike Tyson knock out Bruce Seldon in the first round at the MGM Grand Garden Arena, a fight so short that most of the crowd barely had time to settle in. The energy was electric. Shakur was riding high, weeks away from releasing new music and surrounded by the Death Row Records entourage, feeling untouchable in a city built on high stakes. Then, in the MGM Grand Lobby, everything changed. Shakur spotted Orlando Anderson, allegedly one of the men connected to the mall robbery. He recognized Anderson immediately. Within seconds, Shakur and members of his entourage surrounded him, throwing punches and knocking him to the ground. Casino security cameras captured the assault, which lasted less than a minute. Anderson was left bruised and outnumbered on the casino floor, and prosecutors would later allege that the confrontation provided the motive for what came next. The true motive, however, remains officially unconfirmed. Hours later, Shakur climbed into a black BMW driven by Suge Knight, the feared chairman of Death Row Records. They were heading to Knight's club with a convoy of death row vehicles moving through the city. Las Vegas Boulevard stretched ahead, neon lights reflecting across the windshield. At a red light near Flamingo Road and Koval Lane, a white Cadillac pulled alongside them. The windows dropped. No warning came. At least 13 rounds tore into the BMW. Shakur was hit 4 times, twice in the chest, once in the arm, and once in the thigh. Bullet fragments struck Knight in the head. The Cadillac disappeared into the Las Vegas night before anyone could react. Bleeding from the head, Knight floored the BMW, made a hard U-turn, and raced for help. Police intercepted them minutes later, and Shakur was rushed to University Medical Center. Surgeons fought to control the internal bleeding, eventually removing his right lung in an attempt to save him. He was placed in a medically induced coma after repeatedly trying to pull himself out of bed. For 6 days, fans held vigil outside the hospital as prayers and rumors filled the airwaves. Then, on the afternoon of September 13, 1996, doctors could no longer stop the hemorrhaging. Tupac Shakur was pronounced dead at 25. The bullets were never traced to a recovered weapon, the white Cadillac was never found, and the men inside it vanished into the night. But nearly 30 years later, one of those men would finally break his silence. In the days after the shooting, Las Vegas police had almost nothing to work with. No shell casings that matched a weapon, no fingerprints, and no murder weapon. What they did have was an entourage of witnesses who suddenly couldn't remember anything. Suge Knight, the man behind the wheel who had just watched a bullet graze his skull, left the hospital the next day but didn't speak to investigators for 3 days. When he finally did, his statement was almost useless. He told police he had heard something but seen nothing. A department spokesperson later said Knight's account did little to move the case forward. Shakur's entire entourage offered similarly little cooperation. In the culture Shakur and Knight moved through, going to the police wasn't loyalty, it was betrayal. Whoever pulled the trigger was protected by a code built around refusing to be labeled a snitch. Detectives were left with plenty of suspicion and almost no admissible proof. Investigators did have a name, Orlando Anderson, the same man beaten in the MGM Grand Lobby hours earlier. Gang informants identified him as a suspect almost immediately. He was questioned once, denied everything, and was never charged. Las Vegas police publicly downplayed him, reasoning that retaliating so soon after being humiliated on camera seemed unlikely. Investigators believe the men in the white Cadillac were tied to Anderson's Compton gang and its long-running rivalry with Death Row, but belief wasn't evidence. Without a confession, a weapon, or a cooperating witness, prosecutors had no case. Then, in May 1998, Anderson was shot and killed during an unrelated dispute at a Compton car wash. He was 23. Whatever answers he carried died with him, taking investigators' most direct path to the truth with them. Over the next 2 decades, the case never disappeared. It simply never became strong enough to act on. Journalists, documentary filmmakers, and podcasters kept digging. Books were written, conspiracy theories multiplied, and every few years a new interview or claim pushed the murder back into the headlines before it faded again without an arrest. What law enforcement needed wasn't another theory. They needed someone inside that Cadillac to talk, on the record, in detail, and in a way that could survive a courtroom. They wouldn't get it from an interrogation room or a plea deal. They would get it from something almost nobody saw coming. One of the men inside that car decided to tell his story publicly. His name was Duane Keffe D. Davis. And once he started talking, the case would never be the same. Long before the world knew his name, Duane Davis had already told his story to the people trying to catch him. In 2008, Davis sat down with Los Angeles Police Department detectives under a proffer agreement, which allowed him to discuss his knowledge of the crime without those specific statements being used to prosecute him. Believing the agreement made him untouchable, he described what he knew about the night Tupac Shakur was killed. He was careful and guarded, but detailed enough to give investigators their clearest picture in more than a decade. A year later, he gave a similar account to Las Vegas Metro Police. Neither interview led to charges. Davis walked out of both rooms a free man. For years, nothing changed. Then, in 2015, filmmaker Mike Dorsey released a documentary examining the unsolved killings of Tupac Shakur and the notorious B.I.G. It didn't break the case, but it put the mystery back in the spotlight. Davis noticed. Instead of staying quiet, he leaned in. In February 2018, Davis appeared on BET's Death Row Chronicles. Before a national audience, he described the moments before the shooting, the tension inside the car, and the feeling that something was about to happen. He refused to identify the shooter, saying he was bound by the code of the streets. But he confirmed on camera that the fatal shots came from the back seat of the vehicle. It was no longer a private account protected by a deal with police. It was television. A year later, in February 2019, Davis went further. He released a memoir, Compton Street Legend, under his own name. He detailed obtaining a weapon, getting into a white Cadillac with 3 other men, and driving through the Las Vegas Strip searching for Shakur and Suge Knight. He described the moment their vehicles pulled alongside each other and the seconds before the shooting began. He kept talking. Over the following years, Davis gave interviews, appeared in documentaries, and posted videos online, repeating variations of the same account. 15 years after his first conversation with lab detectives, he had created a public record across police interviews, television, print, and online media, repeatedly placing himself inside the car that night. Davis would later say he thought he'd gotten away with it because of that piece of paper. But the proffer agreement protected only what he said in that room under those conditions. Everything that followed, every interview, every documentary, every page, was his own. And it was all still there when investigators finally came looking again. By the time Compton Street Legend hit shelves in February 2019, most readers assumed they were getting a hustler's origin story, another self-published account from a man who had spent his life around the Compton gang scene and West Coast rap. What few realized was that they were holding a roadmap. The book didn't avoid September 7th. It opened with it. Davis described the hours after the MGM grand beating, the decision to retaliate, and the process of arming himself before getting into a white Cadillac with 3 other men. He wrote about circling the strip, searching for Tupac Shakur and Suge Knight, then spotting them stopped at a red light. He described the moment everything changed, when words gave way to action. Every detail mattered. Investigators had spent decades chasing a case built on rumors, gang informants, and silence. Now, a man believed to be one of the last living witnesses had done what detectives and interrogators never could. He placed himself inside that Cadillac in writing, under his own name, in a book sold to the public. He described obtaining the weapon, the retaliation motive, and the events leading to the shooting almost beat by beat. For a case that went cold because nobody would talk, Davis had provided something investigators could never have forced through the courts: a first-person account that could be compared against informant statements and evidence gathered since 1996. Prosecutors didn't have to start from nothing. They had to build around what Davis had already given them. But there was a problem. A memoir isn't sworn testimony or a police statement under oath. It's a story shaped for an audience, and Davis understood how to create tension, pace a narrative, and land a closing line. Whether every detail was true or polished for effect didn't matter much to readers in 2019. It would matter in court. For investigators, however, the book provided a timeline, corroboration, and Davis's own account of his alleged actions, specific enough to test against physical evidence, informants, and the information investigators had quietly gathered for decades. Piece by piece, a memoir written to entertain was becoming the backbone of a criminal case. Davis wasn't hiding anymore. He promoted the book, gave interviews, and appeared wherever Compton Street Legend could reach a larger audience. Each appearance created another public record, another version investigators could compare for consistency and contradiction. He had spent years talking his way into relevance. Now, without realizing it, he had talked his way into the case file. In the summer of 2023, investigators moved. Detectives executed a search warrant at a home in Henderson, Nevada, and word quickly spread that the Tupac Shakur case had stirred again. For a murder that had sat dormant for nearly 3 decades, the warrant alone was enough to make headlines. It wasn't a false alarm. On September 29, 2023, Duane Davis was arrested outside his home. A grand jury indicted him on a single count of murder with a deadly weapon, along with sentencing enhancements alleging gang activity. He was 60 years old. 27 years after Tupac Shakur was shot on the Las Vegas Strip, Davis became the first, and remains the only, person charged in connection with his death. Consider the irony. In 1996, an entire car full of men reportedly knew what happened. Shakur and Suge Knight's entourage had their suspicions, while Compton gang informants had been naming names for years. Yet nobody spoke in a way that could survive a courtroom. The silence held for decades, protected by a code that valued loyalty over truth and treated cooperation with police as betrayal. The only man who broke that silence was the one who arguably had the most to lose. Nobody forced Davis into the 2008 proffer or the 2009 interview. No detective made him appear on television in 2018, describing the night in his own words. No subpoena compelled his 2019 memoir, where he detailed obtaining a weapon, getting into a car, and hunting down the men who had beaten his nephew. For 15 years, he kept talking, seemingly convinced that speaking around a confession was safer than staying silent. He was wrong. Prosecutors built their case not on a sudden forensic breakthrough, but on the trail Davis left behind. One interview, one appearance, and one page at a time. He pleaded not guilty, and for the first time in the history of one of hip-hop's most enduring mysteries, the case was heading toward a jury. The man who talked his way into relevance had finally talked his way into a courtroom. Nearly 3 years after his arrest, Duane Davis finally walked into a Las Vegas courtroom to face the charge filed against him in 2023. Jury selection began in August 2026, drawing Clark County residents into a case that had outlived many of the people connected to it. 12 jurors and 4 alternates were seated to answer the question that had haunted hip-hop for 30 years. Did this man orchestrate the murder of Tupac Shakur? The problem for prosecutors was obvious. There was no murder weapon, no vehicle, and no forensic evidence directly connecting Davis to the shooting. Most potential eyewitnesses were dead or unwilling to testify. Suge Knight, the only other surviving occupant of the BMW, had made clear for decades that he would not cooperate, even saying testifying would feel worse than the violence itself. So prosecutors took an unusual approach. Instead of relying on forensic evidence, they built their case around Davis's own voice. His proffer interviews, documentary appearances, and memoir became the evidence that physical clues could no longer provide. The prosecution was asking jurors to weigh the defendant's own words, spoken voluntarily over nearly 2 decades, against him. That left Davis's defense with a difficult path. If the account in Compton Street Legend was true, he was implicated, so his attorneys argued that it wasn't meant to be taken as fact. They portrayed the memoir as a fictionalized story designed to sell books and build Davis's reputation, not confess to murder. To save him, his lawyers had to argue that their own client was a liar, not about a minor detail, but about the story that made him a figure in true crime circles. Every interview and documentary appearance had to be recast as performance rather than confession. Prosecutors, however, weren't asking jurors to believe everything Davis had ever said. They acknowledged inconsistencies and shifting details across his accounts. Their argument was narrower. The core of his story had remained remarkably consistent for nearly 20 years, including his presence inside the Cadillac and his connection to the weapon. The trial became a battle over credibility, and that credibility cut both ways. If jurors believed Davis, his own words implicated him. If they didn't, the prosecution's case rested on a foundation that could collapse with him. After 30 years, the story Davis had told for attention was finally being tested for something far more serious. Whether it was the truth. As of now, the trial is ongoing. Opening statements have been delivered, testimony is underway, and no verdict has been reached. Duane Davis has pleaded not guilty and remains innocent unless a jury determines otherwise. Whatever happens next will not be decided by a documentary, memoir, or YouTube video, but by 12 people in a Las Vegas courtroom weighing decades of words against one question: guilt or innocence. What makes this case unlike almost any other isn't simply the 30-year gap between murder and arrest. It's that the prosecution's case rests largely on language rather than traditional forensic evidence. No gun, no vehicle, no forensic trail connecting Davis to that Las Vegas intersection. Instead, there is his own voice, recorded across interviews, documentaries, and a memoir over nearly 2 decades. In this trial, Davis and his words are almost impossible to separate. If jurors believe them, they implicate him. If they don't, the case could unravel. The mystery that once centered on who pulled the trigger has become something stranger. Did Davis spend decades hiding the truth or revealing it? We'll follow the case as it unfolds and bring you the verdict when it comes. Until then, tell us what you think. Why couldn't Duane Davis stay quiet? Was it ego, money, guilt, or something else? Drop your theory in the comments, and if this case pulled you in, stay close. Our next case explores another decades-old mystery where the truth was hiding in plain sight.